They always said the old Harrington house grew strange in the winter, but no one could really explain what they meant until one night on December 24th, 1883. The family had gathered in the front parlor, the way Victorian families often did on Christmas Eve. The lamps were low, the crackling fire by the hearth, shadows moved gently across the patterned wallpaper. Snow pressed softly against the window pane, muting the outside sounds from the street beyond. It was just past 11 when the knocking started. Not from the front door, and not from the walls either. The knocking came from inside the parlor, from the tall, mahogany wardrobe that stood against the far wall. A heavy piece of furniture no one had ever opened in years. 3 slow knocks, then silence. At first, the family thought it was simply the wood contracting with the cold weather. Old houses did that. It was not uncommon. But a moment later, the wardrobe door shifted, just slightly enough, as if it was pressed on, but from within. The eldest daughter, Clara, gasped and took a step back. Her mother shushed her and forced a nervous laugh. But then the knocks returned. This time, louder. What made the room turn cold, though, was the way the knocks began to imitate a rhythm. In perfect rhythm, as if something on the other side of the wardrobe was listening to them. The father stood in place, his hand on the wardrobe handle. The rest of the family held their breath, expecting him to pull the door open and reveal the stray cat, or a draft, or something completely sensible. But he didn't open it. He simply froze there, because through the thin seam of the door, just between the slivers of polished wood, a single pale blue eye appeared, staring out at him and the family. Not wide, not blinking, just watching, and everyone saw it. The father backed away slowly, and the wardrobe door creaked and then slammed shut with a force far stronger than any winter wind. When they opened it the next morning, in full daylight, all together, trembling hands, there was nothing inside, except for an old black coat that had belonged to her father's brother, a brother who had died nearly 12 years before, on Christmas Eve. And this is where it gets chilling. The coat was still warm. After that night, the Harringtons never used that parlor again. They draped the wardrobe with an old sheet, locked the door, and held their Christmas gatherings elsewhere in the home. But every December, without fail, neighbors report seeing the same phenomena. At 11 o'clock on Christmas Eve, the parlor windows begin to fog from the inside. And if you stand on the street and listen closely, you can hear a faint knocking sound. Welcome back, spooky souls, to a brand new episode of Let's Talk Spooky. If this is your first time listening to the show, welcome. Here at Let's Talk Spooky, we dive into the creepy, paranormal, and haunted folklore of some of the most seemingly normal locations. And we cover some downright scary themes. So if that's your vibe, you are in the right place. I am excited that we are finally entering Christmas season because it is, well, next to Halloween, it is my favorite. And to all of my American listeners out there who just celebrated Thanksgiving, I really hope it was a beautiful and peaceful one for you all. When I think of Christmas and celebrating with family, I do mostly think back to one of my favorite traditions that I used to have as a kid. My mom and I used to sit Christmas Eve. We'd get ourselves tons of snacks, we'd put on our Christmas pajamas, and we'd watch the classic black and white Christmas Carol movie. It's probably a tradition that I miss most about being a kid. But I'm hoping that when my kids get a little bit older and it's not so eerie for them, that maybe I can start that up. But there's something really special about a Victorian Christmas. Something that captures the essence of that time of year. Maybe it's the candlelight stories, or the magic that seems a little bit stronger in the darkness of night. But for the first Christmas-themed episode of this month, I wanted to capture that for you all. I wanted to set the mood the best way I think we can, by exploring the magic of a haunted Victorian Christmas. So, light a candle, sit yourself by the hearth, and let's talk spooky. If we could step back 150 years ago and walk down a Victorian street in December, you'd likely notice something strange. Christmas, or the Christmas we think we know, all the glowing fireplaces and cheerful carolers, wasn't quite as bright as we imagine. The air was colder then, the nights were longer, and the season seemed to steep with shadow. For winter came in early Victorian England by mid-December. Darkness fell like a heavy curtain over the towns and countryside, swallowing the horizon long before the clocks tolled 5. In a world lit only by fire and soft putters of gas lamps, the nights felt impossibly vast, quiet, and cold. Snow muffled the streets, fog blurred the gas lights into halos in the air. Every footstep echoed with a strange, hollow tone, the one that winter gives those empty places. It was in this suspended, breathless season that the Victorians believed that the dead drew closest. Most people today think that ghost stories tend to belong to Halloween, and in some cases, yes, that is the truth. But the Victorians inherited a much older understanding of the world, one where Christmas was the true season of ghosts. Long before Dickens and long before the rise of mass printing, winters were a time when the veil between the worlds stretched very thin. We talked a little bit about this thinning of the veil in our Origins of Halloween episode, but the solstices were really a time when it was believed that those who we loved that had passed on could mingle with our world once again. And with winter's endless nights and the uncertainty of dawn, the winter solstice was the most natural pause that life seemed to have. And in its hush, it was easy to imagine that spirits stepping softly into the world of the living and leaving no trace behind. When we picture Christmas 100+ years ago, we think of families gathered around a fireplace, not because it was festive, but because the warmth was survival. Outside, the cold pressed hard against the windows, like a living thing almost. Inside, every shadow cast by the fire seemed to move with a will of its own. And the wind, it seemed to hiss through the chimneys, like whispers from the outside. Old houses creaked as frost tightened their beams, and in those dark hours that lingered after supper was eaten and candles were burning low, and the room drifted into a drowsy, quiet firelight, stories began to surface. And these weren't cheery Christmas tales or hymns. These were the kind of stories that slipped into hush naturally. Whispers of strange lights across the moors, of knocks on shuttered windows, of loved ones long dead who walked again on winter nights. Ghost stories didn't feel out of place to them. They felt inevitable. As the Victorian era surged forward, though, the world outside that firelit circle, it began to change at a dizzying pace. Railways now carved through old landscapes. Factories began to rise, churning out smoke and uncertainty. People left small villages for crowded cities, and with every leap into modern times, there grew a parallel of hunger for the mysterious, the unseen, and a grasp onto something much older and deeper than the soot and the beams that began to surround them. It's no surprise, then, that the spiritualism and seance movement began to be what filled parlors the most, and that tales of the supernatural started to echo through society like a heartbeat that woke. Even the patron saint of a cozy Christmas, the man who gave us Marley's chains and the spectral visitors of A Christmas Carol, Dickens lived through the height of the spiritualist craze, a time when parlors glowed with candlelight and tables were said to tremble beneath the invisible hands. Mediums promised summons of the dead, and ghost clubs formed in the shadows of London's drawing rooms. The entire country seemed to be whispering, "Is someone there?" And Dickens, well, he walked straight into those dimly lit rooms, but not necessarily to greet spirits. He attended the seances run by famous mediums to watch the tables tilt and the curtains flutter and listen to the whispers that claimed to be from the other side. But where others gasped in wonder, Dickens leaned a little closer. He looked for the tricks. He was fascinated, yes, and a believer, yeah, he was that too, but it was more his interest in the people rather than the phantoms. He warned that too many Victorians desperately wanted to believe that they were being fooled by the clever hands of dark motivators. Yet Dickens wasn't cold to skeptics either. He believed the strange dreams and the intuition and the ideas that human emotion might leave an imprint strong enough to feel like a haunting. But his curiosity was more simply that. It was to understand what lingered beyond human imagination. A man who filled his stories with ghosts, who shaped the way we tell haunted Christmas stories, was never truly one to believe in them. He had moments where potentially dark corners of the parlors might have awoken something in the curious author. We see this curiosity play out in his very famous story, The Christmas Carol, as well as in A Single Man, The Haunted Man and the Ghost Bargain, The Haunted House, and The Trial for Murder. Many of these stories were based on his experiences with the dead and how they impacted his idea of the line that was crossed between the world of the living and the world that we couldn't see. And as new technology of the day began to take over, the steam-powered printing press gave literacy a fast-growing empire. And printed material was never as accessible until then. Once, there had only been stories whispered by firelight, but now you didn't need the gift of a storyteller anymore. You simply needed a few spare coins and the thirst for a good, frightening story. Publishers knew that when December came, The readers wanted ghost stories, and they were sure to deliver. But I want to pause here for a second, because I think in a way, I'm sure you can agree with me, it is a little sad to see the oral traditions of storytelling begin to disappear into the modern world. Perhaps that's why we desire our family so close during the holidays. There's some part of our deep soul that wants to rekindle the essence that family brought. Those dark nights when one would sit by the fire and tell a really good ghost story. But Victorians didn't tell ghost stories simply to shudder. Christmas to them was the season of reflection, a time when you could look back on the year's trials, its losses, and the people who were missing from your table. With mortality a constant companion in the era, shadowed by illness, poverty, and short life expectancy, the Victorians understood grief almost intimately. A ghost story at Christmas wasn't merely for the simple entertainment. It was a way to acknowledge the absence of the ones we loved. The way to give shape to a longing of sorts. A way of saying perhaps the dead was not as far away as we thought they might be. And on Christmas Eve especially, they believed the boundary between the worlds was weakened just enough for unfinished business to slip through. A knock at the door after midnight, a silhouette at the foot of the bed, a calling of the name no living person remembered. Whether you were a factory worker huddled in a cramped London room, or a wealthy family reading out loud in a grand parlor, the idea was the same. This was the night when the past reached out to touch the present. And I'm sure all of you right now are picturing the sounds of chains moving slowly up the stairs and the knock of a man named Jacob Marley. And so Christmas became the season not just for joy, but for shadows too, for stories that curled like smoke around the hearth, reminding listeners that the thin line between warmth and chill, light and darkness, and the living and the dead wasn't that far. And so Christmas became a season not of joy, but of shadows, of stories that curled like smoke around the hearth, reminding its listeners that the line between warmth and chill, light and dark, and the living and the dead was one that could be easily crossed. And Victorians didn't invent this tradition, but they embraced it. And that Christmas was a perfect time for hauntings. And if you were a reader in 1864, flipping through the holiday annuals, you might have found a story that didn't just chill you to the bone. It stayed with you. A story of a winter storm, a forgotten road, and a coach that shouldn't have been traveling through the night. One of the creepiest tales ever printed on a Victorian Christmas morning was one that I want to share with you. So, sit back and let me tell you the story of the Phantom Coach, written by Amelia B. Edwards. The storm rolled in long before dusk, swallowing the last of the winter light. Snow came sideways across the moor, thick and blinding, erasing the trail behind him with every step. James Murray had been warned not to travel after sundown. Not on the night when the wind rose from the northern hills and the world turned white. But London was waiting, and he believed himself to be stronger than any superstition. By the time he realized his mistake, the road was gone. He wandered for what felt like hours, boots sinking into the drifts, frost biting through his gloves, until a faint glow appeared ahead, a single candle in a low stone cottage. The door opened before he even knocked. "Storm's a devil tonight," the old man told him. His beard was silver, his eyes were sharp, and he ushered James to the fire, poured him something hot and bitter, and listened as his frozen guest explained his plans to reach the coaching road before morning. The old man stiffened. No one used that road, he warned quietly. Not since the accident. When James pressed for details, the man shook his head and stared into the fire. "All I'll say is this. If you hear wheels on the snow tonight, stay where you are." James smiled, thinking this religional folklore meant to frighten his travelers. But long after the old man retired to his room, James lay awake in the dark, listening to the wind hammer the shutters. And then he heard it. First, a distant jingle of harness bells, faint but unmistakable. Then the crunch of wheels cutting through the packed snow. A coach, moving quickly, too quickly. He rose from his pallet, eased open the loft window, and stared into the white blur of night. But there was nothing. No lantern, no horses, no coach. Just the sound of it, growing louder, barreling straight past the cottage. Something compelled him forward, something between curiosity and the chill he didn't understand. He grabbed his coat and pushed into the storm. The cold hit like a slap, but the sound was already receding. Wheels grinding, horses snorting. "Wait!" he called, his voice torn away by the gale. The road emerged beneath him. As he followed, a long, dark snake of packed snow illuminated in front of him. And then he saw movement ahead. A tall black coach, lamps glowing dimly, and horses plunging through the drifts. No driver turned to look at him, though. No passenger stirred behind fogged windows. Still, it slowed, and the door swung open. "Are you bound for the crossroads?" James shouted. A hand, pale and gloved, in something that looked soaked, rose as if beckoning him towards the coach. Without hesitation, he leapt in. Inside was colder than the night air itself. Much colder. His breath plumbed instantly. The passengers sat rigid in the gloom. 3 men in outdated traveling clothes, faces gray with the slight glow of the light. Eyes fixed forward, and none of them acknowledged him. The door slammed shut. The coach jerked forward, racing faster and faster still, as if the horses were being driven by the force beyond mortal urgency. James tried to speak, but the words froze in his throat. As his eyes adjusted to the dark, he realized the man beside him was wet, from hair to coat to boots, dripping quietly onto the floorboards. And when the lightning lit the windows, James saw the man's collarbone, jagged and broken, protruding beneath skin, the way no living body could survive. He looked to the other passengers, who had the same gray skin, same sunken cheeks, and same waterlogged clothes. These were no travelers. These were victims. The coach lurched violently, pitching James forward. Through the window, he saw it, a jagged ravine, the broken remnants of a wooden bridge, black water, and the coach wasn't slowing. This was the accident. This was the road. One of the dead men finally turned his head towards James, his eyes hollow, mouth slack, as if still gasping for breath that he never got to breathe. James threw himself at the door and the coach hit the ravine, and the world became ice, wind, and darkness. He awoke at dawn on the snow-covered ground. The storm had passed and the sky washed a pale golden glow. The road behind him was undisturbed. There was no tracks, no wheels, no horses, and no wreck. The local villagers found him wandering, frostbitten and incoherent. When they learned where he had spent the night, some crossed themselves, others refused to speak to him at all. Every year since the crash, they told him the phantom coach retraces the final ride of the men who died, seeking one more passenger to join them. James Murray had come closer than most. And though he survived, the prints in the snow around him, deep, dripping, half melted, they didn't belong to any living thing. By the late 1800s, the tradition didn't fade. It simply began to transform. Ghost stories began to slip in and out of magazines and into everyday life, not just in remote manor houses or lonely moors, but the growing cities themselves, on the streets, at crossroads, and along busy roads that carried people home for the holidays. And that brings us to our final segment. And we're going to talk a little bit about some hauntings that were reported not by authors, but by real people. By the late 1800s, this tradition of storytelling, it didn't fade. It simply began to transform. Ghost stories began to slip in and out of magazines and into everyday life. Not just remote manor houses or lonely moors, but they began to grow alongside the bustling cities themselves, on the streets, at the crossroads, and along busy roads that carried people home for the holidays. And that's where we're going to put our final haunted Victorian lenses on. And we're going to look at something that was reported not by authors, but by witnesses. Ones that the newspapers tried to explain, but failed. These weren't stories polished for the pages. These were encounters that left people shaken, trembling, and sometimes refusing to travel after dark altogether. One of the most chilling reports came from London on a cold December night in 1892, along a road that was supposed to be safe, ordinary, and familiar. A place where the living passed through on a daily basis, until one night, a figure dressed in all black began to appear. And she appeared without warning and vanished without a sound. They called her the Black Lady of Finchley Road. And as we close out our Victorian Christmas episode tonight, I want to tell you her story, exactly as it was whispered through the London streets that winter night. A haunting so intense that even hardened cabmen refused to pass that stretch of road after dark, to this very day. They said she appears only on the coldest nights of December, when the lamps along Finchley Road burned so low that the fog rolled thick across the cobblestone. Drivers turned from the holiday gatherings would tell the same stories, their voice dropping, their eyes drifting towards the door, as if to make sure that she hadn't followed. It began the same way, a carriage rounding quite a bad bend. The horse slowed on their own, and then there she was, a woman, standing perfectly still in the middle of the road. Her gown was black, from the neck of the hem, an old-fashioned, heavy, trailing silk behind her through the wet snow. A long veil hid her face, though some said that they could see the pale outline of a nose, and maybe the suggestion of lips, but the terrible stillness of someone who'd forgotten how to breathe. But it was the horses, it was always the horses, who sensed her first. Even the strongest draft mares reared up violently, muscles quivering under the lantern light. Their breath steamed in frantic bursts, and their hooves scraped desperately on the stone as they refused to step forward and refused to pass her altogether. One December night in 1892, a young couple saw her for themselves. They were returning home from a Christmas dinner, bundled warmly, laughing softly in the back of their carriage. The driver hummed a holiday tune, and the road was empty and peaceful, until the horse stopped dead. The driver swore under his breath, and the couple leaned out the window into the cold air, expecting a fallen tree or a stray animal. But instead, they saw a woman. She stood only a few yards away, head bowed, veil stirring in the faint breeze. The woman in the carriage whispered, "Is she hurt?" But her voice trembled slightly, betraying her fear. The driver shouted out for her to move aside, but she didn't. The fog shifted, and she lifted her head. Her face could be called pale and blurred, like paper left too long in the rain. A smear of features and hollow eyes that seemed not to really look at them, but almost through them. The young woman screamed in terror, and the horses panicked, twisting and kicking and almost overturning the carriage altogether. The driver cracked the reins, but the animal refused to move forward until he turned to the carriage and fled back the way they had come, taking the long, winding road home. When they looked behind them, though, the lady in black was gone, but the horses continued to tremble long after she had vanished from sight. In the weeks that followed, more drivers refused fares along Finchley Road after dark. Some claimed she stepped closer each time someone acknowledged her. Others insisted she was searching. And though the old road is busy and modernized now, well lit and crowded, some Londoners still swear that on cold winter nights, when the traffic is clear and the fog rolls in, a woman in a long black Victorian dress stands there, motionless, just waiting. And that concludes our journey through the ghost-lit streets and the fire-shadowed parlors of a Victorian Christmas. From phantom coaches thundering down the frozen roads to the silent figures on Finchley Road, these were the stories that once drifted through winter nights like smoke, reminding listeners that the season of the light was always shared by the space of the season of the shadows. If tonight's tale sent chills down your spine, or if you found yourself imagining the tap of a gloved hand on a window pane, I would love to hear from you. Take a moment to leave a review or a comment, and let me know which Victorian haunting kept you up the longest tonight. While you're here, in our little spooky corner of the internet, don't forget to follow Let's Talk Spooky. It helps us grow, and it helps other spookies find us. And take a moment to check out our socials at Let's Talk Spooky Podcast on Instagram and Let's Talk Spooky on TikTok. Not only does it support our show, but it keeps us being able to tell curious, creepy stories. And if you have your own eerie Christmas encounter, or just regular Christmas story, or regular creepy encounter, please email me or DM me. I'm already gathering stories for our next listener episode, and who knows, your experience might be one that sends shivers down someone else's spine. Until next time, keep your candles lit, lock your windows, and as always, stay spooky.